Hello and welcome to Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business, brought to you by MegaPixx Media. Joining me today is Mark Milke, who is Executive Director of Research for the Canadian Energy Centre. Thanks again for joining us, Mark.
Thanks for having me, Mario.
Well, today, the Canadian Energy Centre released your latest research, your team's latest research, and it's regarding the impact of oil and gas in that industry to the overall U.S. economy. Let's start off the conversation, Mark, just in general terms. What did your research find?
Well, if you're sitting in the United States and you care about jobs, you should care about the U.S. oil and gas industry. And there are, of course, Canadian players in the same. There are 5 million jobs that depend on American oil and gas extraction, refining, export, pipelines, and so forth. So 2 million of those jobs are direct. That's huge. And 3 million jobs are indirect in the EU and that result from the U.S. oil and gas sector. So 5 million jobs in total. And of course, there are tax revenues that flow from that, $240 billion to American governments in 2019. And I mean, even industries, for example, that you wouldn't think have much to do, or at least intuitively have much to do with the U.S. oil and gas sector, such as computer programming. There's about over 300,000 jobs that are dependent indirectly on the U.S. oil and gas sector, at least as of 2019. So the sector matters a lot to Americans. And there are reasons as well why it should matter to Canadians. It's not just an American phenomenon.
So tell me why, first of all, why this is important data to know, especially from the U.S. standpoint.
Well, I think if you're an American, look, there's all sorts of debates in the United States, like there are in Canada and around the world. Should we see the end of oil and gas anytime soon? Is this desirable? And for a number of reasons, it's not. For one thing, you simply cannot replace oil and gas in the modern industrial economy, no matter the aspirational goals of many. A retired professor from the University of Manitoba, Václav Smil, has pointed this out time and time again. Václav Smil has argued that there is an effect from carbon emissions on the environment. He's got a home that's pretty as much as can be carbon neutral or low carbon. Václav Smil, is not in any way opposed to the notion that humans have some sort of impact on the environment via carbon emissions. But Václav Smil is the world expert in energy transitions and has said time and again over the last 2 decades that you cannot transition by fiat. You cannot have a government order a transition. You cannot have a company say we're going to transition away from fossil fuels in the way that some think you can. So that's important to remember for Americans and everyone else. Transitions happen when you have the technological capabilities to do so, not because someone would like it as an aspirational goal. So I think that's important to put into the mix here as well. So for Americans, though, in particular, your oil and gas sector is important for jobs. It's important for tax revenues. It's important for indirect spin-offs like employment income, the ability to pay a mortgage, and also for energy self-sufficiency. We forget this up in Canada, but Americans are deeply interested in national security issues, and for good reason, being a superpower, and have been since at least the end of World War II. So if you're interested in national security and you're an American, the oil and gas sector rather matters because you don't want to be importing all your oil and gas from somewhere else, or you don't want to be partially dependent on oil and gas from some other place, say OPEC. And this has been an issue since the 1970s, right? It's one thing to import your oil and natural gas from Canada, Mexico, some other allies, but it's quite another thing for you or your allies in Europe or Asia to be dependent on oil and gas, say from Russia, China, or Saudi Arabia.
All right, super. Why is this important for Canada to know the overall impact on the U.S. economy?
Well, because we're joined at the hip on energy issues, right? Many people, like the idea of local, right? Buy local. They go down to their local coffee shop and buy a coffee from that shop as opposed to maybe a national chain or international chain. But of course, even if you buy coffee at your local coffee shop, its origin is not in Canada because we don't have coffee plants, unless I missed something. It comes from Brazil, or it comes from Indonesia, or it comes from Kenya. Same thing with oil and gas. We're an interdependent world, and the United States and Canada in particular on energy issues, oil and natural gas, are tied at the hip, so to speak. So, and it's a benefit to Canadians. to export our natural gas and oil down south. In particular, over the last 10 years, we've seen a growth in oil exports as a percentage of income in all the United States, and refineries now make up about 55%. Sorry, heavy oil makes up about 55% of what U.S. refineries now refine. That's up from 25% about a decade previous.
Yeah.
And so that should matter to Canadians as well. We've increasingly been able to ship more product down south despite obstacles placed in our way, such as the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. More oil is shipped by rail as opposed to what it should be shipped by pipeline, but nevertheless, there has been an increase in oil shipped south. So it should matter to Canadians, the health of the oil and gas sector, including the ability of U.S. refineries to take our heavy oil, because that's a massive export item for us. I mean, exports of oil and gas in most years are significant and second only to the automotive sector in terms of exports over the long term.
Yeah. So Mark, where do you go next in terms of your research? What's on tap for the Canadian Energy Center in its next release?
Well, I think we're actually taking a look at imports of oil into Canada in the next several weeks. We did this last year. We've updated the study. And that's interesting because you'll find that certain parts of the country import more foreign oil than elsewhere. Now, again, to my earlier point, there's nothing necessarily wrong with importing oil or natural gas or coffee. The question is, for Canadians, are you artificially hampering your own sector, say exports from, not exports, but interprovincial pipelines from, say, the West to Quebec or Atlantic Canada? And the answer to that, as I think some of your listeners will know, is yes, that has been the case. So we will release something on foreign oil imports into Canada with that open question. Again, there's nothing wrong with importing oil, natural gas, or anything else for various reasons. But let's ask the question of whether in the interim we're artificially hampering our own domestic sector that may be of interest to other Canadians. And that report will be out in the next several weeks.
Okay, super. Thanks again for joining us, Mark.
You bet. Thanks, Mario.
All right, that was Mark Milke, who is Executive Director of Research for the Canadian Energy Center. This has been Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business, brought to you by MegaPixx Media. Thanks for joining us.